Thanks, Gary. Amr, how do I say your last name?
Abu Warda.
Amr Abuar.
Abu Warda.
Abu Warna.
D-A-H. Warda. There you go.
Okay. Kami Waldman.
Yes.
That's the
David Gibson.
Here.
Bridget McAndrew.
Here.
Gary Carter.
Here.
Myron Burr.
Here.
Alex Berger.
Here.
Trip Straub. Kathy Anderson. Great.
Real quickly, Julie, I just want to remind everyone as we're responding or talking today, make sure your mic is on so it can be recorded and people online can hear us.
Okay, let's take a moment to do consideration of the minutes from April 23rd. Does anyone have any comments or any changes they would like to insert?
I move to approve.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Great. Okay, we're going to move on and go through the budget expense recommendation. Gary, are you leading that discussion?
Yes, thank you, Julie. This is just really a heads up because we didn't have the information here in time today to actually put it before you, but just a summary so you can be thinking about next month. In this year's special business district budget, there was $10,000 allocated for advertising. We have discovered a need to update our photo stock for social media and print. Those are photos of events, restaurants, retailers, sites throughout the downtown. And we would like to have used some of those funds and gotten authorization from this group to do so. But we will be putting out an RFP for those services, and then we'll have that provided to you for consideration if you'd like to make that expense this year or not. But that will be a next month type item. So that's all for that one.
Moving on, we are going to go through the fiscal year 27 revised special event budget.
So last month we did the entire event budget for next year. Since then, we have modified the Central Social series, just as an FYI. We have eliminated the late summer and early fall event just because we thought usually the heat or the cold in that switch period there just is too unpredictable. And we just felt that it was a better use of funds for something else. So we have modified that event, taking two of those time periods away. So happy to entertain any questions about that.
Think it makes sense.
Motion to continue. Okay. So next we are going to discuss the fiscal year 27 special business district budget.
Yeah, so we were given a heads up last month that we would be considering this as the city progresses through its budgeting cycle. The typical process in the past has been that some form of this group, the predecessor was the Economic Development Advisory Committee, made a recommendation of the special business district funds to the mayor and board of aldermen, who would either accept that or alter that and proceed to put that into next fiscal year's budget. So I know we've had discussions about different spendings or why we were spending different things in different areas, but really I had a lack of input building this. So essentially what I have done is created a budget to start the discussion with that really is very similar to what we've done in the past. So I've gone back to FY fiscal year 23, and with the proposed being on the far right, the fiscal year 27, you can see that much of it is similar to what we've done in the past. There are two things that stand out that I'll go ahead and walk you through real quickly. The first one was professional study services. This is something that I make a run at every year in the budgeting process here recently. It is a service called Placer AI. We most recently used the service in connection with our master planning process. It gives us information about people. Basically, in a nutshell, it works through all the apps on your phone that you just blindly accept the tracking on. And so as you go to Oceano on Friday night and then go home or stop at Ivy for a drink first and then go to Amers and then go to the Cardinals game and then go home, we have that data. And then they cross-pollinate that with census tract data. So we can't see your street address, but we can see the census tract that you live in, giving us an idea of home income, demographics in the house, and so forth. So the particular use case for this is twofold, at least in my opinion. One, we can share that information with people like Tripp and Julie and Amer running businesses here, and they can see where their customer bases are coming from if they don't already know that through other sources that they have. And then we can also overlay that information with the available retail space that we have in Clayton to better target end users. Then, we may say that we want a jazz bar. Well, we can also go back and look at like the Blue Strawberry in the Central West End and see where their customers are coming and going and live, and it may or may not work for Clayton. So that's that particular use case. The next item of significant change from previous years was I tried to readjust the budget and put the $44,663 in the downtown beautification. I don't have a particular idea for that funding. That would be something for this group in connection with the city council to decide on at a future date. But those are the two significant changes or insignificant changes really, that I've made in this year's recommendation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
I got some questions. So on the adopted 23, 24, 25, does that also equal actual?
Yes.
Meaning that was the budget or that's actually what came in?
I mean, within a few dollars.
Right, yeah,
because
but
the
no major
revenue.
deals.
Yeah.
And so on the professional studies and services, 10,024, was that for Placer AI as well, or was that a different professional study and service charge?
Is that the long range plan?
That was, I'd have to go back and check my records, but that would have been, professional, it would have been some kind of contract.
Would not be Placer AI though.
No, it
That's the
was
main
not.
question.
No, that wasn't really a subscription that we had with the master plan. That was really rolled into the consultant that helped us with the master plan.
And on the Placer AI subject, I'm fairly familiar with it and it is wicked cool. I mean, it gives you all kinds of data. However, they're not afraid to charge you, as you can see. So how is it that if we choose to buy that for a year, that we're going to get $15,000 worth of value out of it? Meaning I would try to draft some kind of ROI financial. Okay, we're going to spend $15,000. What kind of returns do we expect? Because my gut tells me that we won't even come close to getting that back from experience in other areas of the city. So, I mean, I think it's phenomenal information, but we'll all look at it and we'll say, oh, that's cool. Okay, did it turn into dollars? I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
another use case might be Tripp, that this committee decide that they don't want to fund the entire amount and that they fund some portion of it, because I know that other departments in the city would also have a use case for that.
And you did mention that, hey, if the SBD buys it, and then you share it with Oceano and Straub's, I mean, that, you could argue, okay, well, let's get people to use it, okay, where are my, and then if I target social media, whatever, based on some of the information. But again, I'd almost take a pulse of the market, the SBD group, and, hey, if we did this for you, would you use it? And or have somebody teach them how to use it and maybe place their.
I don't, they wouldn't have access. The licenses would work within the city, but they could certainly, they could,
Request X, Y. I mean, that's was your comment, was that we could help different retailers, restaurants, yeah. It's
I mean,
just-
and I agree with the ROI statement. My only counter to that would be that, I think by benefiting the existing businesses and or, with the strategic targeting of the available space, that's more of an investment in the community in good, much like our events. We make $0 off our events. They're free, they're open, they're non-ticketed. But, hopefully it is providing some exposure for the city.
Well, if you're not going to share it with the restaurants, will you share it with the building owners who are, I mean, we have so much vacant space on the street.
Yeah,
I
any
mean,
of the
that-
data will be shared with Amr or Julie. I think you said we weren't going to share it with
I
the,
thought that's what
no,
you
no,
said.
we are. I think I was making the difference
Wouldn't
between,
have my own password to get into.
Oh,
The
okay.
City would
Okay.
control what they pull, but we could request, hey, I'm looking for XYZ, then, is
Okay.
that right?
Oh, okay.
Gary?
yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'd be super interested to know. I think it'd be, beneficial to know.
And again, you do it for a year, then you find out, did people use it? Did they request info? How did the city use it to help landlords fill their buildings? It could be great. It is really cool information.
It could be very
It's just
great,
taking cool information and turning it into return on that investment.
or it could be paralysis by analysis too.
Yeah, too much fire hose, right?
Yeah.
So I'm curious how we have $0 allocated in the parking improvements.
That goes back to a broader discussion we just had with the city council at a retreat last month. I have this really great parking PowerPoint that I can give to you at a future date if you fall asleep. But the end story is that we've done an analysis. I worked with Matt and our Public Works Department, the director there. We spend about $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 on those pay stations. Analysis of return on investment on the usage, it doesn't prove out. So there is some contemplation that we will be moved app-based only system in Clayton. One, we don't have the ongoing cost associated with those because not only is there a purchase price for those, but you have a connection and software package each month, each year with associated with those. Then you have maintenance, which involves staff time.
But Gary, I think with those in past years, though, money was allocated to purchase more pay stations.
Yes.
So I think, Julie, that's like before we had, because these pay stations don't last very long. So next year, we're just going to stop replacing them, or at least limit them. So rather than having 2 or 3 per block, we'd have 1 per block. So I think but I think maybe asking about other sort of parking improvements, is that kind of what you were thinking of? Yeah. So the idea is next year we'll just stop buying those stations, or at least vastly limit, because I think we have some sitting around that we can use, some spares. If every single one on a block breaks down, then we have ones
We
that we
currently have 4 on a block.
Yeah.
So,
So-
one each half block on
But I-
both sides.
I think once you go live with the app only, I think you should just take all the stations out. Not that I'm turning this to a parking meeting, but because it's creating chaos and confusion to a lot of people.
Yeah, well, the plan isn't ready, Palmer.
Okay.
So, we still have a lot of thought process to go. And then, we want to make sure that we're serving everyone that comes to Clayton. So one of the benefits of the pay stations is that they do take coins and credit cards, for those that, don't want to use a phone or for whatever purpose. So, and there are some locales in Clayton that we will probably always maintain some kind of pay station. The lot at the Justice Center that we run on behalf of the county there, that would just be a necessity.
And I think when you're on that part, I go back again, when you're done with that program, when you're ready to launch it, and I think it'll be somewhat helpful to state on the website of the city of Clayton that if you don't have access to the app, any businesses in Clayton, they can take care of your parking expense. Banks, restaurant, they all have it. You walk in my restaurant and you don't have idea how to do this, I do it on my tablet right there for you. You put it on your tab. The bank does it, everybody does it. So if you give people the idea that if you don't want to do this, you don't want to download the app, visiting Clayton and sit there and fuss with it the whole time, go to whatever business you're visiting and they can take care of your parking for you.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that the parking subcommittee will be
Yeah.
working with, since this group and the other committee has members on.
I'm with Amr though, and those are people just, if you watch these people just standing out there trying to figure those things out, it's a nightmare. And passport parking is used all over the country and it's zip zap. And if somebody doesn't have an app, like Amr said, go into the restaurant and say, I can't download the app.
Cool.
So Gary, what about like all the signage we were discussing in that subcommittee about, for public parking and kind of like a little bit of a campaign about letting people know about the public parking garages that are available? Where does that fall in like budget?
Well, I mean, certainly could fall into this budget here. I didn't necessarily try to anticipate every expense that we might want to do. So, it's certainly, this budget can be adjusted, and the marketing for the downtown garages, the signage, whether they're pink or white or green or whatever, that we decide that we'll do for the public parking in downtown could be an expense out of this budget too.
Yeah, look,
We could-
has a nice.
We could put the 45,000 towards it.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. So is that, could that be like, I mean,
Yeah, I mean-
I didn't know what you meant by beautification, so I didn't. Yeah.
It was a random category that I put the money in.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, we could label that a different.
Right, because I just want to emphasize that I know with this committee, like the budget was so tight that we do need to like, if we figure out like a real big ask that we have for something, like we can like move stuff around to get that. So even though like these numbers don't show there's a lot of wiggle room, that is available to us. So again, I know that parking was like a very high priority, but if there are other things, we can hopefully work through that. So
Yeah, I mean, just be mindful, whatever comes out of this budget goes into the operating budget, which is pretty lean at this point. We're anticipating a deficit next fiscal year. So if we have things we want to add, like the parking signage, if we can do it within this budget, that's obviously ideal. I think the 45,000 probably goes a long way, and Placer's a great tool. If we want to pay for it out of this, that's $15,000 worth, or you can shift that money if we decide ultimately to put that in the budget somewhere else in the general fund. That gets you to 60,000, which could definitely buy some signs and get those installed on buildings. And if that's the priority of this group, then we can make that adjustment before you adopt the budget. And try to firm up some numbers too. Maybe talk to a couple contractors and try to get some kind of idea of what it might cost to get the lit signs.
I'd be interested in seeing the Pacer information to see like how much it's changed this year. It looks like we had it this year. We didn't have it the 2 years prior, but we had it the year prior to that.
No, we've not had it. We've never had a subscription ourselves.
That was my
Oh.
first question, Julie, was what was that 10,000 from a couple years?
That was some
And
other,
it was
that
not
was some other
Placer
study,
AI.
and I'd have to go back and
Okay.
that could have been a parking study, or at this point, I just can't remember.
Yeah, the Placer data we had was a component of the comprehensive
Yeah.
plan
Okay.
back in.
It was
2023,
rolled up
2024.
into with the consultant that Anna used with the downtown master planning process. It was just a service that they provided. My issue with that information is it's now over 3 years old. Which has some value to it, but I think, since we've come out of the last 4 or 5 years, things are changing again, and I don't find that especially when you're working with recruiting businesses, offering 3 or 4-year-old information is not a good sign.
Gary, I have a quick question too. Is that fund balance number, is that current? 77,216
That was at the end of last fiscal year,
at the end of, okay.
FY26.
So going into,
Yeah, I'm sorry, FY25.
going into 26, that's what
Yes,
we had.
yes, sir.
Okay. And then as far as our estimated amounts for the current fiscal year, are we eating into that fund balance at all, or do you expect that to grow?
Right now I have it, revenues equaling expenses.
For fiscal year 26? Everything we collect this year is going to go,
No, for 26, we are in a deficit spend. We had anticipated 544, we are spending 555.
okay. So the fund balance will reduce then by 11,000 or so.
Yeah.
All right. I'm just trying to figure out what we've got to play with down there. too.
About
So
60.
you got about 60,000 plus. It's also sitting there in reserve. They could be used anywhere within the special business district. We're not required to carry a fund balance within the special business district fund, because the idea is we collect the money, it all gets transferred out,
Yeah.
and then we spend it
That-
throughout the year.
That's an excellent point, David. Thanks for bringing
You
that up.
really have 100, even if you did Placer, you've got 105 to put towards other things. The beautification money plus the fund balance.
And I would argue that in this account, there's no need for a fund balance unless, we decide we're gonna build a bridge in 100 years and we're saving up for that, which I don't anticipate this group to do. The businesses and the property owners are paying each year. And my argument on having a zero fund balance in this account was, they've paid in, let's give them something for it.
Under revenue, what's the definition of a financial institution tax?
A tax on a bank.
And so have we lost a ton of banks? Why has it gone down so much?
These were the adopted numbers, Trip, so I don't.
I asked if they were actuals and you said they were very close.
Yes, but when we're talking about 18,000 on a $537,000 budget, I think that was probably the numbers that changed some. The more the more accurate numbers, are between the 6 and the 2.3 that you see there in 25 and 26.
We can get those actuals for you, Trip.
Well, that's what I say. Everybody has a budget, but putting the actual, next to it,
Yeah,
okay, well, then you see where you
we-
hit
we
and
can-
where
we
you
can
missed,
shift it
and
so
then it helps you plan for
We
the
can shift
future
this so that
years.
it's actual 23, actual 24, actual 25, adopted 26, estimated 26, and then proposed
Perfect.
27.
Again, we want to budget correctly, right? We want to guess right, or as close to right as possible, even though we won't be perfect. So having that accurate historical stuff is great.
Would the, in terms of this group making a recommendation, Gary, does that happen at this meeting or does that come in June, like prior to the, what were you foreseeing?
Yeah, June would be fine.
June would be best. So, I think if, just understanding, because I think everybody in this room, the city council will really look at the budget in really the end of July and have work sessions in August. So I think, if there's a recommendation from this committee to spend money on Placer II, money on parking signage, then that's kind of, I guess then, so they would make a recommendation, Gary, and then it would kind of be up, because obviously they don't, no, I don't think anybody in this room understands how much parking signage would cost, but then there would be some attempt to get a number. So the recommendation from this group would happen, but they wouldn't necessarily delineate an amount of money, I guess.
Well, you could delineate amount of money in this. So this body makes a recommendation to the city council.
Right.
And the city council can accept it, change it, do whatever they want with
Right.
it. But you know, in the thought process, if we know we want to make parking improvements, including marketing, for the downtown garages and signage for downtown garage, we can put a number X in.
Okay.
And then throughout the process, we would come back to let you know how that was shaping up. If we budget $100,000 for those and it turns out it costs 45, that's what we're going to spend is 45.
Right.
And
Right.
then you could have a discussion about making a recommendation to the council in a later month into next fiscal year about, oh, well, that only costs 45. Now we want to do something else, or
Right.
you could put it back in the fund reserve.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that people didn't think that this group had to come up with a succinct amount of, you know what I mean? That they're.
No, we can budget a number.
Yeah.
I mean, and if it, you know, if we budget $100,000 and it costs $10,000, that doesn't mean that staff gets to spend the other 90 on whatever they want.
Right.
We've
right.
spent 10 and we have to ask for authorization to spend anything else.
So Gary, real quick, on the 2025, the downtown beautification was 25,000. Like, what was that used for? Do you know?
Planters.
Planters?
Yeah, we did the rest of the planters throughout downtown, those big planters. They're out of here. We had other intersections that didn't have planters. So
Okay, so then the 8,500, is that just like the plantings for the planters? For the next year?
I think that was the final stage of those.
Okay. So in this beautification budget, is that the plantings or is that through Public Works?
The 44,000, you mean? I think that was kind of just, because Gary said because was that any of that or that was
I
just
just
money?
mean like the upkeep of these planters, and I'm asking
Right.
because I've heard residents complain about them, and you know, they would like them to look nicer and, you know, help
Hmm.
beautify downtown. So I'm just curious, is any of that?
So the funds expended in the previous years before 27, in 25 and 26, they bought the planters and the plants and dirt that went into it. After that, that becomes a maintenance item to Public Works and
Okay.
the maintenance shows up in their budget.
Yeah, it
there.
goes into Public Works.
We budget, we historically have budgeted about $5,500 for the watering during the summer. But the maintenance after they're installed shifts over to another department and
Got it.
into the general fund, basically.
Okay.
So will the watering be in the beautification?
The watering's a separate line item, plant watering.
Okay, okay.
So
Kami, he had said that the 44,000, basically the 44,000 and the 77,000 at the bottom under fund balance,
Right.
those are two that are completely non-allocated so far.
that's correct.
But it's really 60,000.
It's really 60.
Okay.
65 or so.
Why is it
We'll
65?
add the estimated column and then we'll update the fund balance down below because the revenue at the top's, the revenue at the top is 544. The total transfer is 555. So that's about $11,000 deficit. But we'll clean those numbers up or at least label it differently.
Okay. Does anyone have any additional comments regarding the budget? Okay, motion to continue. So next we'll talk,
So just for clarification, so I will go back and readjust this budget to the actual numbers for the prior years. Change that downtown beautification for proposed next year to a general parking, or put that back into the parking improvements for now.
okay.
And then we'll have a more accurate number for the fund balance too.
Would you also be able to show like the interface or like results of like what this tracking AI thing looks like? Just because I have no idea what it looks like.
Yeah.
And just kind of like, and is it just like a snapshot, or is this something that, you know, you're paying for a full year? So every week you get a readout, or like, there's so many numbers. And I mean, it seems wild that we could track someone from here, then all the way down to a Cardinals game, then all the way back. And like, blows my mind. So
Wild or scary?
terrifying actually, but I'm curious, like, just really the, return on investment, like what are the numbers are we getting that we can actually use and just kind of what that looks like?
Yeah,
Okay.
I can get a presentation of that
Okay.
together.
Thank you.
I love the idea though of like, in the packet though, Gary, you talk about, because we're trying to encourage WashU's shuttles to come into downtown Clayton because just, their shuttles go up to basically Forsyth. But if they can come into Clayton, because we have so many students that come to like different, like Sushi AI, but that could be information that you could show to WashU. Hey, you've got all these students coming, like see how impactful it would be for you to bring your shuttles up here. So I mean, that would be.
Sushi AI was the use case that when I last talked to Placer AI, I've talked about this in one of the committee. I have lost track now. But anyway, so that was an example that they pulled for me. They asked me, what do you want to look at? And so I'm like, I want to see what Sushi AI is doing. And so the top three were WashU was the place of origin for travel point. From WashU to Sushi AI was overwhelmingly, I think, over 50%. The next one was SLU University.
Wow.
And the next one was UMSL.
Was where?
UMSL. So it's all college students.
Oh,
Um,
gosh, yeah.
And the use plan would be, all right, so they're coming here for lunch or dinner or whatever. What else are they doing that, you might fill those other spaces on Beamiston with, to
Right.
keep them a little
I
bit
think
longer.
one aspect of that is, and I was making this statement based upon a friend of mine who made this remark, who lives in one of the new residential buildings. Ceylon, is that?
Ceylon.
Yeah. He said that there's a good percentage of Washington University students who are living in the building he's at because it's perfect for them. Not very far away from campus, and when they're not on campus, they have activities here. And so I wonder what is the experience of the apartment buildings per se for Washington U students. I'm sure in the Moorlands, it's always been strong, but with these new buildings, is it stronger? I'm assuming it is, which is a real big advantage.
It's a huge percentage of the renters we have downtown.
Yeah, we don't.
International students.
We don't have a lot of families in our apartments. I mean, we do, but they're, like, they're adding a wing to their house and they need to stay for 6 months or
Short
something.
term, yeah.
But overwhelmingly, I would say WashU, this is just anecdotally from walking around all the time in downtown, but, majority are students, some young professionals, and then you have empty nesters who still want to have a presence in St. Louis, but don't necessarily need the home to maintain anymore.
So the apartments that they're building on Merrimack, are those going to be configured kind of like the other ones? Because basically, some of those apartment buildings, I went through all of them, were built almost for college students. There was no storage. There was, it was ready-made for them. Are the ones on Merrimack going to be kind of the same?
They're basically all the same. I mean,
Okay.
they
So we're gonna
look a
have
little
students over
different on the
there.
outside, but you're not gonna find a home that has like a giant storage capacity.
No, yeah, no, but I mean, like the old apartments, say it in Morelands had more than, I mean, the bedrooms were so small.
Yeah, these are all modern designs, so
Okay.
they're basically all the same. They're, the different one will be when the World Trade Center, 7-Up building, however you know that building as, that's a retrofit. So that will be somewhat different than the rest of them, but, basically, new apartments, especially in a semi-urban environment, are cut and paste.
Well, I was just curious, then in that case, then the people that we're going to attract, if we do attract anybody into the stores or restaurants or stuff, are going to be geared for college students rather than for the regular residents at Clayton, probably.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a presence of empty nesters
It-
in our apartments too.
Actually, it's a little different with the college students because I get a lot of them from WashU. They're mostly international.
Right.
WashU rely on almost 25, 30% of her students from the international scholarships. And when people come to WashU and they go around the West End and they go around Clayton, if you're sending your kid for 4 years and you're abroad or you're overseas, you really don't want them to live in the West End. That's basically how it goes. So they go and get these apartments in Clayton, thinking that it's safe, they can walk to eat, they can walk to the park. I get a lot of Chinese, Japanese, I get a lot of students from that area. I mean, and I think that Merrimack building you're talking about is gonna be exactly the same.
Yeah.
These
Well-
builders are actually designing these apartments mostly for that purpose.
But you say you are getting a lot of them at Oceano, so they have plenty of money to
WashU
spend.
is one of my big account, just put it that way.
Students, not faculty and staff.
Both.
I don't think the demographic of students in Clayton in the apartments, I mean, keep in mind, some of these apartments are $3 a square foot, which is top of the market in the Midwest outside of Lakefront Chicago or Nashville.
Well, and I would say, Kathy, just because it's not just undergrads too, it's graduate students, and there's a lot of residents, like medical residents, that live in the different buildings too. So we're not talking about just like 20-year-old kids.
Yeah, I was just
Yeah.
trying to picture, then who do we gear
Yeah,
all the space on the street level
right.
to?
No, I agree. I mean, I think.
Makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I mean, using the data to, again, economically develop, but also having our businesses, like having Julie, having Amr be able to use it in order to benefit themselves, I think would be great.
It's gonna
So,
be fabulous, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
So.
agree.
Any additional comments regarding the budget? Okay, motion to move on. Next, we have our infrastructure and parking subcommittee update.
One of the members want to give the update or?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, we've been in, I think the big discussion has been around, trying to, really help some of the employees of the different restaurants, like, because I think a lot of them still park on the street, occasionally move their cars. So there's definitely been a movement to try to facilitate some parking arrangements with different employees of downtown businesses, like really the retailers. So restaurants, other sort of retailers, so that employees can get some discounted parking in the garages, because some of our garages are pretty empty. So Mike Shadle, who's the chair of the Economic Development Committee, I know has been working with Gary to talk about how that arrangement could look. Again, to try to help and alleviate some of the parking congestion on the street. So,
In addition to that, we've been talking about light up signage that would go on the outside of every major parking structure to really showcase, public parking with neon lights. And so that's what we were talking about earlier, would be potentially inserted into the parking improvement portion of the budget once we have those actual numbers next month.
And then staff will be utilizing that subcommittee as a resource as we discuss changing the parking program in Clayton, that moving away from the pay stations.
And there's an additional app now in downtown Clayton, correct?
Yes, so the city, in addition to Passport, offers Park Mobile. The interesting point is that they are now both under the same ownership, so it's the same.
Okay. Any questions regarding the parking subcommittee? Okay. Motion to move on. Lastly, we have our communications presentation.
Yes, and Leslie's here to run us through this. Lindsay, I'm sorry.
Green.
Okay, hi.
There you go.
Oh, now you can hear me. That's wonderful. Okay, it looks like we are a little past 2, so in the consideration of all y'all's time, I was going to start on page 6 of the presentation. Everything before that is background information that informed the strategy. So if you have questions about those specifically, I'm happy to answer them, but we can come back. I want to get to the actual meat of it first for you. So what I'm going to lead with here is our marketing and communications policy. This is based on the city needing to be a neutral, universal, and credible voice. So what that means is we are neutral in ways that we will be avoiding conflicts of interest and any accusations of favoritism, and it protects the freedom of speech in the public forum, basically. Universal, anything that the city official platforms talk about needs to be accessible by all residents. So that tends to be things like utilities or something that anyone can access who lives here. We don't guide anyone who reads our content to spend their dollars a certain way. We can't fundraise. We can't say, pay this here. So we also don't share information that's behind a paywall or about different fundraising appeals. So this is all important because it makes the Clayton Voice credible and trustworthy. So we're mindful that we're stewards of the public trust and expectations. We present information that is fact or policy based. We don't use persuasive language. We don't try to influence readers. We want them to form their own opinions. They are free agents to do what they want to within Clayton. We're just information. So for examples of what we do link to, government agencies, accredited schools and nonprofits aligned within the city's mission, community partners, health and safety organizations, and civic engagement platforms, organizations with official city contracts or city-funded sponsored entities or event sponsors. I'll get into the nitty-gritty of those in a little bit. So what we definitely don't share, political campaigns, partisan content, or lobbying. We don't share discriminatory content. I feel like that goes without saying. Misleading, unverified, or speculation. We don't share alcohol, tobacco, or adult content outside of the approved guidelines. For example, the upcoming wine and whiskey, or no, sorry, the previous wine and whiskey and music and wine festivals. Obviously, we're promoting wine, but it's a Clayton entity, essentially. So that's understandably why. We don't share non-city board vacancies or election filings. We also don't share election results within Clayton until they've been verified by the Board of Elections. So which is why you won't see day after an election, congratulations. You will see it when they're sworn in. Next slide. Example of share relationships. One back, 7. Yes, thank you. You'll see that city affiliated, we will always share our own entities. City associated, I will occasionally share something from the school district. Event partners, utilities, government agencies, had some very interesting conversations with, for example, MSD about their rainscaping program. Part of Clayton is within the district that has the opportunity to apply for grants if you're doing a residential rainscaping project at your home. Now, I won't share the grant information, but I will share information about rainscaping from MSD because everyone within Clayton can access that. So we don't advertise per se, but we are all about sharing information. When we talk about a city event, we will share the names of participating food trucks, musicians, or other entertainment. They're not endorsements, they're factual about what to expect from the event. During Restaurant Week, we'll showcase restaurants that are Restaurant Week participants. Participation in Restaurant Week is open to all restaurants within our zip code, but we only talk about the ones who opted in. So in that way, we are sharing a Clayton event because those are participating partners within the Clayton event. Similarly, we're official partners for third-party events like the art fair. We don't share other third-party events, but as we are an official event host of something like St. Louis Art Fair, we will share that information. So next slide, how the policy impacts economic development and practice. What we don't share, for example, is Sam's Sleep Store is having a blowout sale. Go check out what's on sale at Sam's. We don't do that. What we would share is something along the lines of, if you're looking for a seasonal refresh for your home, we could suggest you go to Bob's Backyard, Gloria's Garden, or, Sam's Sleep Store. The strategy that I've put in place in following with our policy is that we share groupings of economic outlets in Clayton. So grouping businesses with similar services creates a narrative. It's a narrative of life in Clayton that elevates multiple businesses simultaneously. But in creating that narrative, we're also sharing and helping readers visualize that Clayton is a place that they want to be. It's a place that they can visualize living in, or maybe think of new ways to explore their own city that they wouldn't have considered. It helps us lessen bias, but it also, at the same time, builds our brand, which is another reason that people are attracted to Clayton. So for the next slide, here's how economic development is positioned within communications. Positioning our businesses within narrative experiences creates content opportunities. Generating themed content stories has applications across multiple formats: social media, city publications, and eventually things like Welcome to Clayton packages, which I know have been discussed. Ideas are happening around them. They're not ready to roll out yet, but I want to get there. Above all, these narratives are structured to be fair and consistent with the existing economic landscape, but in a way that encourages growth. It's a reliable and repeatable standard. The same rules apply every time for everyone. It removes subjectivity, it prevents favoritism, is defensible, and builds trust over time. It's also something that it's easy to replicate for whoever comes after me. We're building communication practices that are credible, manageable, and defensible long-term across administrations, priorities, and changing digital landscapes. So for an example of a print format is City Views. Those went out in the mail yesterday. If you haven't gotten yours yet, you can expect to very soon. I have a preview if you want to see it. But what we did is showcasing economic development content in an advertorial way. So this is going to look more like a magazine. It doesn't explicitly say economic development anywhere on there. But what it does, it's all the content is tied to the seasonal publication. It's themed. It's giving ideas to get out in Clayton, get out on a patio. Here's some great patios. Different ways to enjoy the best that our city has to offer during that specific season. This aligns with economic development priorities. And this style will be a regular feature starting with the summer City Views. And following City Views, this is repurposed into a website news item, social media posts, and newsletter content. And content for City Views is always based on input from department heads. I talked to Gary about how we wanted to prioritize and talk about this. I talked to Kristen about how we could develop something that supports events and supports how people have been talking about what they want to do in Clayton. Also, you'll notice when you get your City Views, trying to address the questions that I've heard about parking. A new section that will be in every City Views from now on. There is a quarterly calendar that pulls right out. You can stick it on your fridge. It has all of our events, all of our meetings, but more importantly for this group, has publicly available parking garages with the map and how they can find them. So trying to address our parking questions by being proactive and not explicitly saying it's economic development, but presenting information that helps us all.
Excuse me. Can these be distributed to all the hotels too? Because folks from out of town may be driving day.
That is on my to-do list.
I don't know.
Yes. That is on my to-do list of finding a way to do that. It would be definitely investment in cost and possibly a redesign for content, because the City Views is definitely geared toward residents. But like I said, with that Welcome to Clayton packet, having something similar for hotels has been discussed. Next slide is social media. So you can see how we are talking about economic development on social media. You may have seen it around Mother's Day. We created a quiz for plan your mom's best Mother's Day in Clayton. Yeah, glad you liked it.
I loved it, yeah.
So one story, multiple lives across social media. It was the lead item on the website. It was across social media, and it was also featured in the weekly newsletter. But again, this shows us how we can feature multiple businesses within Clayton without specifically saying to patronize one. And now is where I would love your input. I want to encourage all of you to be an advocate for the city and share our events and news. And obviously that includes being an advocate for business owners, because I know you are them. But I want to hear some ideas and feedback as to what next steps could be other than me asking you to like and share our content.
I love the pullout. That's really great. The pullout calendar. That was a great idea. It's really good. And I think rather than, Kathy, I think that's a great idea to make sure, hotels have something, but I feel like it could even be something like a simple piece of paper, with maybe the monthly event calendar or, QR, something
Yeah.
simple so that it wouldn't be that big cost. So. But yeah, no, I think it's great to just keep thinking about what else we can do. Cause for you guys to know too, City Views which is one of the biggest ways that we get information out to our residents. Surprisingly, I wish people, I think it's great that it's a great communication tool, but people use that and get more information from that than like our website or social media. So we've just realized how important it is to put information in there.
And that's something that's really fascinating for me with a history background in marketing is Clayton has such a unique demographic, a wide expanse of age ranges who engage with media differently. So we're trying to hit multiple types of demographics and how they consume information at the same time, which is why one piece of information has to have multiple lives and multiple platforms. What Kristen's handing out is something that I've been sending to the city council every month, which is just a slip of paper that has our monthly events, some helpful information, and occasionally in the back, an article that's relevant, the rainscaping I mentioned. Now, I know this isn't probably as slick as we would want for a hotel, but this information could be the seed of what becomes that. And again, all of this information is always available online on all of our platforms. So it is already available to those hotels if they wanted to recommend things to do for people that weekend, if they're asked. But also I think from an economic development standpoint, having a directory of, restaurants that are nearby the hotel or something like that, that is something that I am trying to ideate and come up with a solution for you guys.
Yeah, in the interim, we have on our website now, live maps, Google-based maps. So you can find one for parking that has all the parking garages in downtown Clayton, but it also has two other variables that you can activate or deactivate. And one is restaurants and retail. So you can click on that, see where the parking is, then you can click on restaurants, and then you can hover over each space that's marked on the map. And it tells you what it is. And then the other one, which is also available space. So we have all the available space in Clayton mapped, and then those other two variables are on there for restaurant and retail. So if you wanted to see what other business was around those spaces.
It just, as you were talking, I was just wondering, when people are staying at hotels, do they know they're staying in Clayton, or do they just think they came to St. Louis?
It's probably 50.
I'm just curious,
I think
because if everything's on the Clayton website, they, I don't know, we have a bunch of folks coming in for a wedding next week, and I think they're coming to St. Louis.
Yeah. Well, no one.
And there's nothing you can do about that. I'm just saying.
No one takes a plane to Lambert to Clayton. They're coming to St. Louis is where you bought your ticket
Yeah,
to.
yeah.
But I do think that, people do seek out our market. Our hotels are, at least last I checked, are very healthy in their occupancy. So,
Yeah.
but to address your question earlier, Kathy, I think me and Lindsay can come up with, like a one piece to get to the hotels that direct them to this information. I'm a big advocate for, I think most people are using their phone.
Yeah, restaurants
And,
near me, yeah.
one of the concentrations that we've done through the parking committee is make sure that all our parking garages are identified on a map. The mayor's been helping me with that also. I think it's great to have handouts, but, as I travel myself, when I go somewhere, I'll be going to Milwaukee to a conference in a couple weeks. I'm not going to look for a piece of paper. I'm going to open my phone and
Right.
see what's in walking
I
distance.
just saying, the only reason I commented on that, if everything's on the Clayton website, these folks don't think of themselves as being in Clayton, but Google is what,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's
Google,
far more important to have the Google map actually reflected or a map available than I mean, outside of residents, I don't know if anybody's actually going to our website to
Right, right,
look for that much.
thanks.
Lindsay, are you posting personally on social media?
I post as Clayton.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Because I actually do think like asking people to like and repost is a good, really good strategy because the city doesn't have very many followers. And I think just having other people like and repost would help to get some more followers, which would spread news a lot more quickly than any of this, I think would.
And I will say, in case anybody's wondering, because I find it really frustrating, it is, I mean, our city social media is Downtown Clayton Mo, which is frustrating, but we can't get Clayton Mo because somebody has it. And Lindsay has tried like multiple times to try to figure out, it's just frustrating. So if you're wondering why it is specified as Downtown Clayton Mo, it's not by choice.
There's a Clayton, North Carolina that calls about every 5 years trying to get downtown Clayton.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We get those emails. I get a lot of emails from people looking for different Claytons around the country.
There's a Clayton in North
Communication.
Carolina, there's a Clayton in Georgia, and they call about every 4 or 5 years wanting one of our domains.
It's just frustrating because I feel like we don't want to talk about just downtown, but we want to talk about the whole city. So, yeah,
And within our content, we don't just talk about downtown.
right, right. But I just hate that our social media tag is Downtown Clayton Mo.
I wonder if there's a different, rather than Clayton Mo, if it's like,
Something else. Yeah, I'm sure City of Clayton has taken City of,
Right.
yeah. So anyways.
but I really do think that it could be a missed opportunity to not do that because all of that is really good content. And I think, the Instagram is kind of spotty as in terms of like how many posts are happening or the quality of the content or the relevancy of the content. And so I feel like if there was more content and then you're tagging other businesses and specifically asking people to like, repost it, share it, stuff like that, especially other business owners, I think it'd be one of the quickest ways that we could spread information.
I can share that when we do talk about other businesses, they are tagged. So part of that is trying to provide an opportunity for those businesses to share those posts, make their marketing easier as well. So
Yeah, for sure.
Would it be possible, like, every Friday, like up in the the whatever goes across the top, just to say like parking free, like come on down, parking's free all weekend or something, and just like a standard post you post every Friday, letting people know,
on social.
like on Reels, yeah, like on Instagram or something like that, just so like it reminds people of that.
And look into that.
Love
And then
that.
I noticed you're like, you can't spotlight specific restaurants, but like, is there a way like that we could like say opt in, right? Well, just like maybe like opt in, 'cause you were saying if they opt into something and say, these are a restaurant, spotlight these restaurants, and then each week you pick one, but they have to opt in to be one of those that are selected.
That wouldn't be in line with the policy.
You can't do that. Okay. What about like sharing, like people that have been here for like 20 years, we just had, the Creperie, be here for like 20 or however many years.
30.
Alex, 30, there you go. And I don't know if we were able to even, are we not able to like highlight that at all?
That we would have to look into that further.
We do typically, we have celebrated like historic milestones, like Pratzels had their 50th and we put that in our Friday
Okay, so we
newsletter,
can
but
There's
Stuff
going to be
like that.
significant
yeah,
milestones.
significant milestones. And we'd have to know that information ahead of time to be
Advance.
able to celebrate
Okay.
them.
Yeah, because I think that, I know you can't spotlight things, but anything that could, help promote our local businesses. And so you're saying like if we group them, that's the key.
Yes.
You have
Okay.
to generalize
Right.
the advertising for all, not for one.
Yeah, I made all these, we've had 2 or 3 discussions now between Myron, Lindsay and myself. And this is the same learning process I went through. I asked the same question. Why can't we? Let's do this, and then after having the policy presented, it makes sense. But
Totally.
I think what it does show is that there's more opportunity for Lindsay and I to work together to do those groupings,
Okay.
to get that kind of stuff out.
And I love the pullout from the city views. That was really smart. That's great. Yeah.
Anybody else?
Great work.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Thanks, Lindsay.
And look for city views in your mailboxes this week.
Thank you.
Okay, any additional public comments? Okay, motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you.